Tony Curtis said something. Johnny Carson stood up from his desk, signaled the band to stop, and revealed the truth he'd kept hidden for 30 years. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. March 1985. The warm glow of tungsten lights, the familiar cream-colored curtains with geometric patterns, the orange guest chairs that had hosted presidents and poets and movie stars. Another Thursday night. Another taping. Doc Severinsen in his signature flamboyant jacket, the orchestra ready with their instruments, Ed McMahon settling into his spot beside Johnny's desk. The audience was buzzing with anticipation. Tony Curtis was the guest tonight, Hollywood royalty, star of Some Like It Hot, Spartacus, The Defiant Ones. At 60 he was still handsome, still charismatic, still carrying that movie star magnetism that had made him a legend. Johnny was in the middle of his opening monologue. A joke about Reagan. Another about the weather. The audience laughing in all the right places. The rhythm was perfect, polished by decades of practice. Then Johnny introduced Tony Curtis. The audience applauded as Tony walked onto the stage, waving, that familiar smile lighting up his face. He shook Johnny's hand, sat in the guest chair, and they began the interview in the usual way, light, funny, nostalgic stories about old Hollywood, about working with Marilyn Monroe, about the golden age of cinema. Everything was going exactly as planned. Until Tony said, almost as an aside, almost like he was making a joke, "You know, Johnny, I never thanked you properly. For 1955. For what you did that night at the Brown Derby." Johnny's smile faltered. Just for a second. But in that second, something changed in his eyes. A shadow passed across his face, like a door opening onto a room he'd kept locked for 3 decades. The audience didn't notice. Ed McMahon didn't notice. But Doc Severinsen, who had worked with Johnny for years, who knew every micro-expression on that famous face, lowered his trumpet slightly and watched. "The Brown Derby," Johnny repeated quietly. "Tony, I don't think. I should have said something years ago," Tony continued, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. "But I was ashamed. I was scared. And you never said a word. You kept my secret for 30 years. The studio fell silent. In the middle of the studio, Tony Curtis said something and Johnny Carson stood up from his desk, signaled the band to stop playing, and revealed the truth he'd been hiding for 30 years. Johnny pushed his chair back. The scraping sound echoed in the suddenly quiet studio. He stood up, not casually, not with the relaxed movement of a host transitioning to a commercial break. This was urgent. Deliberate. He raised his right hand toward the band. Doc Severinsen, midway through playing the bumper music, stopped immediately. The other musicians followed, instruments lowering one by one until the studio was completely silent except for the hum of the stage lights. 300 audience members sat frozen, confused, sensing something profound was happening but not understanding what. Johnny looked at Tony Curtis, who sat in the guest chair with tears beginning to form in his eyes. Then Johnny turned to face camera one directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced even the breathing in the studio. "Tony just brought up something that happened 30 years ago. And I think it's time I told you what really happened that night." Ed McMahon's face showed genuine shock. In 23 years of working together, Johnny had never stopped a taping like this. Never broken the fourth wall like this. Never let his personal life intersect with the show in this way. Johnny walked around his desk, past the guest chairs, and stood in the center of the stage, between his desk and the audience, in that liminal space where performers rarely ventured during interviews. "In 1955, Johnny began, his hands in his pockets, his voice quiet but carrying through every corner of the studio. "I was hosting a local show in Los Angeles. Nothing big. Nothing like this. Just trying to make it in television. And one night, I was having dinner alone at the Brown Derby in Hollywood. The audience was completely still. Camera operators adjusted their angles silently, instinctively knowing they were witnessing something important. Tony Curtis was at another table. Johnny continued. He was already a star. I recognized him immediately. And I watched as something happen that I've never spoken about publicly. Until now. Tony Curtis sat in the guest chair, no longer trying to hide his tears. He nodded at Johnny, giving him permission to continue. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened at the Brown Derby restaurant on a Tuesday night in April 1955. Johnny Carson was 29 years old. His local show, Carson's Cellar, aired on KNXT in Los Angeles to a small but loyal audience. He was nobody important yet. Just another young comedian trying to break into television in a city full of young comedians trying to break into the same industry. He ate dinner alone most nights. His first marriage was falling apart. His career was stalling. He spent most evenings at cheap restaurants, writing jokes on napkins, wondering if he'd ever amount to anything. The Brown Derby was a splurge. He couldn't really afford it, but once a month he'd treat himself to dinner somewhere nice, somewhere he could watch the real stars, the successful people, and imagine what it might feel like to be one of them. That night, Tony Curtis was sitting 3 tables away. Tony was 30 years old, at the height of his early fame. He just finished filming The Purple Mask. He was Hollywood's golden boy, handsome, talented, beloved. He sat with a group of studio executives, laughing, confident, everything Johnny aspired to be. Except Johnny noticed something the executives didn't notice. Tony's hands were shaking. Badly. He kept them under the table when he wasn't holding his drink, but Johnny could see the tremor when Tony lifted his glass. He could see the way Tony's jaw clenched between smiles. He could see the sweat on Tony's forehead despite the cool restaurant air. Johnny had seen that look before. In Omaha, before he moved to California, he'd had a friend, a fellow radio announcer, who'd struggled with alcohol. Who'd hidden bottles in his desk drawer. Who'd shown up to work with that same shaking, that same forced smile, that same desperate attempt to hold it together. Tony Curtis was drunk. Not just tipsy. Drunk in the way that meant he'd been drinking all day, in the way that meant he needed help. The dinner ended. The executives left, clapping Tony on the back, oblivious or uncaring. Tony sat alone at the table for a long moment, staring at his empty glass. Then he stood up, unsteady, gripping the table edge, and headed toward the restaurant's back exit. Johnny hesitated. This wasn't his business. Tony Curtis was a stranger, a celebrity, someone who lived in a completely different world. But something, maybe the loneliness Johnny felt in his own life, maybe simple human decency, made him follow. He found Tony in the alley behind the restaurant, leaning against the brick wall, crying. Not quiet tears. Broken, gasping sobs. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and desperate. Johnny approached carefully. Hey! You okay? Tony looked up, startled, trying to pull himself together. I'm fine. Just needed some air. You're not fine, Johnny said gently. And that's okay. But you shouldn't drive. Not like this. I don't need help from some. Tony stopped, squinting at Johnny. Wait. You're that guy. From Carson's Cellar. The local show. Yeah. You're funny. Tony laughed, a broken sound. You're really funny. You're going to make it. Me? I'm going to die in some drunk driving accident, and nobody's going to care because Hollywood will just find another pretty face. Johnny sat down on the alley ground beside Tony, not caring about his one good suit getting dirty. How long have you been drinking like this? 2 years. Since I got famous. Since I realized that being famous doesn't fix anything. It just makes you better at hiding who you really are. They sat there for an hour. Johnny didn't lecture. Didn't judge. Just listened while Tony talked about the pressure, the expectations, the way alcohol was the only thing that made the anxiety manageable until it became the thing creating the anxiety. I need help. Tony finally whispered. But if I check into rehab, If anyone finds out, my career is over. The studio will drop me. The fans will turn on me. I'll be done. Johnny made a decision in that moment that would define both their lives. Then we don't tell anyone, Johnny said. You come to my apartment. Tonight. You stay there. We'll figure out how to get you sober without anyone knowing. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Tony Curtis stayed at Johnny Carson's apartment for 37 days. Johnny canceled his show tapings, claiming a family emergency. He used what little money he had to stock his kitchen with food and keep Tony comfortable through withdrawal. He held Tony while he shook through the worst of it. He stayed up all night when Tony couldn't sleep. He listened to Tony's fears and rage and grief. It cost Johnny opportunities. Producers called with potential guest spots on bigger shows. Johnny turned them down. His agent threatened to drop him. Johnny didn't care. His wife asked questions. Johnny gave vague answers that created even more distance in their already failing marriage. But Tony got sober. When Tony finally left Johnny's apartment, he made Johnny promise something. Never tell anyone. Please! This has to stay between us. Johnny promised. And for 30 years he kept that promise. Tony Curtis went on to have one of the most successful careers in Hollywood history. He starred in over 100 films. He earned an Academy Award nomination. He became an icon. And Johnny Carson went on to become the king of late-night television. The most trusted man in America. The voice that put the country to sleep every night. But neither man ever mentioned what happened at the Brown Derby, or the 37 days that followed. Until tonight. March 1985. On live television in front of 300 people and millions watching at home. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stood in the center of the stage, his story finished, his secret revealed. The studio was silent. 300 people processing what they just heard. Tony Curtis stood up from the guest chair. He walked over to Johnny. The two men looked at each other. 30 years of unspoken gratitude, of shared secret, of bond forged in an alley behind a Hollywood restaurant. Tony embraced Johnny. Not a Hollywood hug. A real embrace. The kind that communicates everything words can't. You saved my life, Tony said, his voice breaking, caught clearly by the boom microphones. I've been sober for 30 years because of what you did. And America needs to know that Johnny Carson isn't just funny. He's the best man I've ever known. The audience erupted. Standing ovation. Not the polite applause of entertainment, but the thunderous recognition of something true and profound. People were crying. Ed McMahon was openly weeping at the desk. Doc Severinsen had set down his trumpet entirely, hands over his face. Johnny, who rarely showed emotion, who had built a career on maintaining perfect composure, stood with tears streaming down his face, holding on to Tony Curtis, letting America see him as fully human for perhaps the first time. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny pulled back from the embrace and turned to face the audience. His voice was rough but strong. I didn't tell this story to make myself look good, he said. I told it because Tony wanted to tell his story. Because 30 years ago, we both learned something important, that showing up for someone when they're broken isn't heroic. It's just being human. He looked at Tony. You did the hard part. You got sober. You stayed sober. You built a life. I just sat with you when you needed someone to sit with you. Tony shook his head, laughing through tears. You gave up a month of your career when you could barely afford it. You risked everything for a stranger. You weren't a stranger after that first night, Johnny said simply. The audience stood again, applauding, crying, witnessing something television rarely showed, two men being completely, vulnerably real. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After that night, Johnny and Tony's friendship became public. They spoke openly about addiction, about helping each other, about the cost of fame and the value of human connection. Johnny kept one reminder of those 37 days, Tony's first sobriety chip, given to him years later. It sat in Johnny's desk drawer until his final show in 1992. That night at the Brown Derby changed two lives. But the night Johnny revealed it on television changed how America saw both men, not as celebrities, but as humans who chose kindness when it mattered most.